I mean, it just seems that the economy does better under the Democrats.
What's going on? Did you hear what I just heard? OMG. This week, I came across this video clip. Donald J. telling us that the Democrats build a better economy. What? For those who might be unaware, Donald J. started his little political rants on the Democratic side. So I say we go back to the video and check out everything that Donald J. and Wolf Blitzer had to say in 2004.
I've been now around long. I think of myself as a young guy, but I'm not so young anymore. And I've been around for a long time. And it just seems that the economy does better under the Democrats than the Republicans. Now, it shouldn't be that way. But if you go back, I mean, it just seems that the economy does better under the Democrats
Well,
than
it
the
certainly
Republicans.
did well under Clinton.
Well,
but I wouldn't suggest it was so great under Jimmy Carter.
That's true. That's
if
true.
you remember,
That's
the interest
true.
rates.
No, I know. It's Jimmy Carter was not in the same thing, but certainly we had some very good economies under Democrats as well as Republicans. But we've had some pretty bad disaster under the Republicans.
Interesting. Three things that I pulled out of that. Point one, he said it shouldn't work that way under Democrats. I'd really kind of like to know why that is. Now, granted, I think it's because Republicans keep saying that they're fiscally conservative, right? And they keep saying that they're better at managing money because they try to stay in the budget. But we're going to find out in our research that that isn't true either. I think it's also interesting that they bring up Jimmy Carter, so we'll take a peek at that, because it's also worth noting that things really started to get out of control under Nixon and under Ford, the two Republicans beforehand. In fact, it's a little bit like blaming the challenges Obama had in his economy on the Democrats, because it really actually started under Bush when the mortgage crisis happened. And by the way, this video was in 2004, which brings us to our third point.
But we've had some pretty bad disaster under the Republicans.
We've had some pretty bad disasters under the Republicans. Now it's only 2004. The 2008 crash, the mortgage crisis, hadn't even happened yet. So this 2004 thing that they're talking about here, and this probably relates to some of the war efforts, is Afghanistan, 9/11, entering Iraq. But we also have the tech bubble bursting. Some of these things happen when we have less regulation, the whole deregulation that the Republicans have convinced a lot of Republican voters that it's good for them. But it really isn't. In the end, it usually helps big business and hurts the everyday consumer. But let's take a peek at those numbers that Donald Trump brings up. Donald J., I cannot believe that we're actually agreeing. Why didn't you stay a reasonable person? Or maybe he really wasn't reasonable then either. I don't know. But this Donald J. in this video surely is making a little bit more common sense. The first resource that I want to show you is something called the misery index. Now, the misery index is super easy to calculate. All you do is take the inflation rate and add it to the unemployment rate, and you find out how much misery Americans are in. This resource is easier to use than actually looking up the inflation and the unemployment rates. So I use it quite a bit in class, and I will note it for you in the doobly-doo, which is the description. Before we get back to the other tips, if you would, please subscribe. I've got lots of great content for you just like this that'll help you out with your finances and help you become more fearless. The other thing is if you'd like this video, other people will get it. And I'd also like you to put any questions you might have about your finances in the comments, because I'm always looking for good content that people are really interested in. Now, back to the regular programming. Now, I've already switched this over to the one that's by year. And if you notice, it notes it by year, but it also provides for you who was in the White House at the time, who was the president. Now, if you notice right above me, there's other ways to look at this, like which Congress it was, simply by year. But since we're talking about whether Democrats or Republicans do the economy better, we're just going to stick with the presidential one. Also important to note is the blue line is going to be the unemployment rate, and the red line is the inflation rate. We start out in this resource at Truman in 1949. Truman was a Democrat, but I think it's worthwhile to get to something a little bit more recent. Here's Eisenhower, also a Democrat, and the 1950s were like the most prosperous era. I've got other videos on that, so we'll skip on through. Here's our two Kennedy years. And I'd like you to notice these overall numbers that you're seeing historically. Like we see lots of 7s and 9s and 8s on average. And historically, the target inflation rate was about 3 to 4%. Recently, the Fed wants to keep that at 2. So anytime it inches slightly above that, people get a little bit anxious. But historically, we've even had higher inflation than that. Now, notice. We move in then to the Johnson years. Sometimes the Johnson administration is referred to as the bread and butter administration. And these were years where we implemented a number of social safety nets. And these were just getting started, like Medicare and Medicaid. Those were enacted in 1965 under the Johnson administration. So there were some extra dollars being pumped into the economy during this stage of the game. After we have Johnson, we have Nixon, who's our first Republican elected in a number of decades. Now, we all know the tragedy of the Nixon administration, right? He was a crook. He was a criminal. He ended up resigning because he would have been impeached. Donald Trump has done these things and more, and honestly, should also have been removed from office and never reelected. But let's take a peek at what the economy starts to do under Nixon. At least for these two indicators, inflation and unemployment combined, we start to see the first double digits in many decades. Then Ford comes into office, and please notice what begins to happen. They start to escalate quite a bit. And Ford isn't doing anything to rein this in. And then, as Donald J. mentioned, we move into the Carter years. And in 1980, we see the highest amount for the misery index, 20%. I do think it's important to note this, however. Paul Volcker was nominated by Jimmy Carter or appointed as federal chair. You see, the chair who had been there before, G. William Miller, didn't do anything to try to rein this inflation in. It is noted as the great inflation at the Federal Reserve and is used as an educational point that it's better to increase interest rates or rein in the money supply before things get out of hand. Because Volcker was there for 2 terms attempting to get inflation under control. And interest rates went as high as 20% to do it. I think it's also important to keep in mind this. The chair of the Federal Reserve is not a political position, or at least it should not be. The president cannot fire the Fed chair. So Jimmy Carter had to work within the auspices of Miller's term. This essentially meant that the president during that period of time had very little control over inflation. But as soon as Jimmy Carter could, our Democratic president, he put in somebody who would do a good job and take the hard risks and take the hits to increase interest rates to get the economy back on track. Back to the misery index. So now we're taking a peek at the Reagan years. Look at all those double digits. Now, granted, they start to get under control and get down to single digits by the time his vice president takes the presidential office, George H.W. Bush, Bush number one. And please notice how those double digits, though, continue on. These years also mark a major shift. This is when we start to take on more debt. We'll take a peek at that. And the budget deficits get a little bit out of whack because this is when we give the rich a great big tax break. The first cut starts in 1981 when Reagan takes office, and he convinces Congress to take the maximum tax rate down to 50%. Right now, it's like 37.6. But then when he's reelected in 1984, he convinces them to go as low as 25. And by the way, this is when the major wealth gap starts between the middle class and the wealthy. Now, here's our Clinton years. And I think it's very important to note under these Clinton years, a couple of things that start going on. Not only do we start to see these numbers fall again into single digits and reasonable amounts below 10, but under Clinton, from 96 to the year 2000, we actually run budget surpluses. We actually have more revenue coming in than expenses going out. What? These are the last 4 years that we've seen this in basically modern history. I also want to note this. This wasn't all due to Clinton. At the time, Congress was controlled by the Republicans, and they had to work together. You know, I'm going to correct that. They chose to work together to try to do something for the common good for the American people. They also did, unlike Doge and this chainsaw illegal business, they systematically worked together to reduce the cost of government. That's how it should be. That's how it works in a democracy. But let's get back to the chart. Now we see George W. Now our numbers are still under double digits. Yay. But we also see a lot of volatility through these years. Again, we have the events of 9/11, we have Afghanistan, we have entering Iraq. There's no weapons of mass destruction. We have people who are at Guantanamo. And we also have a lot of things going on in the stock market. We have the tech bubble burst. We start finding out about more areas of corporate greed, like Enron and a number of other companies' books come to light. And there's a lot of market crashes during this period of time, a lot of market volatility. In fact, I did a video that includes what's considered the lost decade. Those were basically under the Bush years. The value in the S&P 500 started at one value and ended at about the same value at the end of the 10-year period, with tons of volatility in between. And so I did a video talking about the 4Ds of investing that can help you regardless of what the market is doing. I'll link it up after this video. Now let's take a peek at those Obama years. Now, Obama inherited kind of a mess. The mortgage crisis happened in 2008. He was elected, and he got into office to have to deal with a recession, which he did, as many Democrats do, by putting some money in the economy to get things rolling. And you see how he got things rolling right there. Now, I know, Donald J., you're always telling people you had the best economy, but that ain't true. Look at right there where we can see that Obama's numbers right before he gave that economy to Donald J. We're doing fine. We're doing mighty nice. Which brings us to our Donald J. years, and then we have Biden. But I think it's also important to note, part of the reason that Trump's numbers start to escalate is because of COVID. And Biden had to deal with COVID. Please notice how he ended up bringing things to more reasonable terms again. Now, of course, that's only one indicator. Well, really two: inflation plus unemployment, right? Two indicators. Let's look at Another one. This one shows the national debt for about the last 20 years. There you see 1999, the last time we ran a surplus. That's why the bar graph is down below, because it actually was a surplus. And then we move into the years of George W., and we start to see the deficit on the rise. Just to be clear, we run a deficit every time our expenses exceed revenue. So we're paying out more money than we're taking in. A surplus means that the government is taking in more tax money than it's paying out. Now, I think it's also fair to note that if you look here under the Bush years, even though it kind of spiked up right away, because these are war years, right? But it does start to go up again before the 2008 crash. Then we see Obama's spending to get the economy back on track. And please notice that that number starts to go down. He starts to get the budget working better. And then we see Donald J. take office in 2016. And please notice how it starts to go up again. And I also think it's worth noting, because Donald J. and the Republicans won't tell you this, but Donald J. had the larger deficit than Joe Biden. Now, both of them had a COVID bill, but Trump's was bigger than Biden's. Now, this graph happens to be from the Federal Reserve. Harder to read, but muy importante. It goes back a little bit further than the other one that we've been looking at. If you notice right here, that's 1980. That is when Reagan is elected. And please notice the larger dips that we continue to see that we hadn't seen before. This very low dip, that's Don J. That is the COVID spending after he gave the rich another great big tax break. It can easily be said two things. One of them, much of the deficit that we have right now is because the rich got major tax breaks from the Republicans. On and on and on. And this is the other thing that we can say. This is when the divergence between the wealth in the middle class and the wealthy got larger and larger. We need to go back to the politics we had before. We need to go back to what we used to do under the Democrats, starting with FDR. Tax the rich and create more social safety nets, which brings me to the final indicator that's important to our research, growth in the GDP. Now, before getting too involved in this lovely little chart that I've pulled up here for you, I think it's important to note that I think the GDP needs a little bit of reworking. The GDP just tells us overall economic growth, but it doesn't necessarily tell us in what industries, who it's benefiting. And the other thing is we produce a lot of things that have nothing to do with actually collecting income or compensation for it. For example, the stay-at-home parent that takes a tiny little baby and grows it into a happy, capable adult who actually is productive for our society. That is something important. Or maybe you have a garden and you grow your own vegetables and you can them and you've created this wonderful thing for your home. Maybe you're good at woodworking and you actually build much of your own furniture, or you do your own oil changes or car repairs. Are you following me? None of this gets included in the GDP. And one of these days, I'm going to do a video on that too, because it's very important that we start to look at these economic indicators and determine, are they really helping us or are they hiding dirty little secrets? But back to the GDP. The green areas here mean growth. Things are increasing, things are doing well. I don't want to spend too much time on the green areas. I think it's important to point out the red ones. The red ones mean that there's no growth in the GDP or there's negative growth. It's contracting. And I just realized I never even told you what the GDP is. The GDP is the gross domestic product. It's what we produce as a nation. And that's why when I went through all those other things, those are things that we might produce that aren't included in the GDP. Back to those red bars. This first little one here, that one is Nixon or Ford. I don't know which, but it's owned by a Republican. Right next to it is a tiny little one too. This would be in 1980. We would say this might belong to Carter or Reagan. And you know what? To be fair here, we'll give it to Carter because we're going to hear a lot of Republican names as we look at the other red ones. That bigger dip right there, well, Reagan owns it. This is the 1980 recession. This, of course, is as they're trying to get inflation under control. Now, I know it's a little blip, but there's another little red line right there. That one's owned by George H.W. And then if you notice right there, we've got some bigger bars. This first one is owned by George W. Bush. This is the recession that was started by the whole 2008 mortgage crisis. And then the next red bar, well, that one's owned by Donald J. Now, I'm not going to fault him too much for that. That one happens to be COVID. And I know lots of people don't think we should have shut things down and all of that. And it's actually the Democrats' fault. But this is the thing. I'd rather save people's lives and make sure we get it right. At least that's what I think. So there you have it. Generally speaking, Democrats make the economy better and Republicans don't. I'm going to put up two different links. One of them is to the 4Ds of investing so that you can figure out what to do possibly with your own investments, regardless of what the market's doing. And then I'm going to put up the playlist for other economic indicator videos just like this. And I'll see you back here soon.